A quiet town. Nestled among rolling fields of golden corn and humble barns with weathered red paint, the small town of Willow Creek felt untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Here, in the heart of America's Midwest, every street seemed familiar, every neighbor a friendly face, and every sunrise predictable in its pastel beauty. Willow Creek's population barely scraped 2,000, but to its residents, this was enough. Life moved at a deliberate, gentle pace. The ticking of the courthouse clock in the square was as reliable as the seasons.
We know you were there.
Main Street, the town's vital artery, hosted a string of mom-and-pop shops, a corner bakery where the smell of cinnamon rolls greeted those up before the dawn, an old-fashioned barbershop filled with the murmurs of gossip, and O'Malley's grocery, where customers knew by heart the days when fresh produce arrived. Children's laughter echoed from the park swings every afternoon, and the local church bell rang on Sundays, its clear tone calling everyone, no matter their troubles, together, just for a while. Despite its outward calm, Willow Creek harbored layers unseen by passing eyes. There were the old disputes between farming families, ancient secrets buried under pleasantries, and the unstoppable march of time that brought new faces to the high school football stands every fall, while others faded quietly from memory. But above all, there was the shared certainty that this town was, and always would be, a safe haven, where tragedy only flickered on distant television screens, and loyalty was just another word for survival. Grace Thomas fits seamlessly into this environment. The Thomas home, a 2-story white clapboard house with blue shutters and a porch swing, stood near the heart of town. Grace's mornings began before sunrise, while soft mists still clung to the grass outside. She moved through each day with the warmth of routine, brewing coffee for her husband, Mark, packing school lunches for their 2 young children, and greeting neighbors from the porch as the world woke up. She was known for her kind smile and her willingness to lend a hand, whether organizing the fall festival or bringing covered dishes to neighbors in need. If anyone bothered to look closer, they might have noticed the slight furrow on Grace's brow, or the way her gaze lingered at the edge of her picket fence, as if waiting for some distant storm. But in Willow Creek, life's worries were as invisible as the wind, spoken of only in hushed whispers behind closed doors. In this tranquil world, the seeds of chaos lay hidden beneath the surface, soon to be drawn out by a single, unstoppable truth. But for now, Willow Creek remained suspended in its calm, held together by routine, neighborly kindness, and the illusion that, here at least, nothing truly terrible could ever happen. A family that seemed happy. From the outside, the Thomas family embodied the picturesque American dream. Their white clapboard house, with its neatly trimmed lawn and overflowing flower beds, was the kind neighbors pointed to with admiration. On any given morning, the kitchen window would glow with warm yellow light, revealing scenes of ordinary, enviable domesticity. A mother humming softly as she flipped pancakes, 2 children in pajamas bickering playfully over who got the first plate, and a father reading the local newspaper with a mug of black coffee in hand. To visitors and friends, the Thomas household radiated harmony. Grace, ever attentive, orchestrated the rhythms of family life with a quiet competence that made it all look effortless. She kept the home running like clockwork, schedules established, comforts anticipated, small crises smoothed over with a calm voice and a reassuring smile. She knew the exact way each member liked their eggs in the morning and never forgot the details that mattered. Mark's favorite aftershave, the quirky way little Sophie arranged her stuffed animals before bed, and the exact formula that would coax her son, Eli, out of a sulk. On weekends, they'd gather for pancakes and bacon, each person recounting their week, laughter bubbling up and blending with the sizzle from the stove. Mark, as far as the town could see, was the dependable husband and doting father. He worked a steady job in a local insurance firm, his name known and respected, his handshake valued around town. After work, he'd toss a baseball with Eli in the yard or help Sophie with her science fair posters at the dining table. He always found time for the big moments: parent-teacher conferences, dance recitals, little league games. His smile in family photos was broad and convincing, his gestures affectionate, if sometimes a touch absent-minded. Evenings in the Thomas home formed a comforting ritual. Homework was done at the kitchen table while Grace made dinner, her soft voice guiding spelling lists and correcting math mistakes. Afterward, the family shared meals of pot roast or meatloaf, passing plates and stories around as easily as breathing. After dinner, Mark might retreat to his study to handle a few work emails while Grace read stories to the children, her voice weaving magic just before their eyelids drooped in the safety of freshly tucked beds. To friends and relatives, especially Mark's parents who lived nearby, the Thomases were a model family, present at every neighborhood block party, attending church services as a unit each Sunday, and hosting backyard barbecues in the summers. Grace threw herself into organizing school drives and community bake sales, drawing admiration and quiet envy from other mothers who marveled at her energy. Yet beneath the glossy surface, as in every family, there were hairline cracks, moments when laughter fell flat and kindness turned mechanical. Sometimes, Mark's gaze would drift off during family dinners, his responses growing perfunctory. Occasionally, Grace caught herself moving through her routines on autopilot, her heart not always keeping pace with her hands. Words of affection sometimes felt rehearsed, the spark between husband and wife dimmed by years of repetition and unspoken disappointment. Still, disagreements remained minor and private. A forgotten anniversary, a grumbled complaint about overtime, a sigh over a burnt casserole quickly followed by gentle apologies and smiles. The world never saw these cracks. Even the children felt only the faintest ripple of tension and quickly forgot beneath layers of warmth. Outwardly, the Thomas family presented a life to be admired, a home of laughter, stability, and gentle traditions. Neighbors nodded at the family's perfect Christmas lights. Friends remarked on the children's good manners, and Grace never missed an opportunity to share a kind word or a comforting gesture. The melody of their life played smoothly enough to cover any discordant notes. For everyone in Willow Creek, and for a time, even for Grace herself, the Thomases were the very image of happiness, the kind of family others aspired to become. If there were shadows lurking in their sunlit rooms, no one noticed them yet. The illusion of contentment was complete. And for now, life continued in the gentle, familiar rhythm that everyone had come to rely on. Secrets unveiled. It happened on an otherwise unremarkable Wednesday afternoon, when the rhythms of Willow Creek were proceeding with their usual quiet predictability. Grace had left work at the library a little earlier than usual, carrying a tote filled with overdue books and gently used children's puzzles she planned to donate to the after-school room at church. The air was sharp and brisk, carrying with it the faint promise of rain. She had planned to swing by her best friend Jessica's house, intending to drop off a casserole and catch up over coffee, as they did at least once a week. Jessica's friendship had always been a balm, the rare confidant who seemed to understand Grace without a single word spoken, someone who had stood beside her through every triumph and trivial sorrow since college. The house was unusually quiet when Grace arrived. The curtains were drawn, the porch swept free of the usual clutter of toys and garden tools. She let herself in, calling out for Jessica, but the silence was heavy, disturbed only by the faint hum of voices from upstairs. Something about the way she hesitated at the foot of the staircase shifted the air. as if her instincts were warning her that the familiar was about to turn strange. And so, with hesitant footsteps and a sick feeling blooming in her chest, Grace climbed the steps and followed the sound. The words reached her before the faces did. A slice of conversation, half whispered but sharp enough to cut. "I told you, no one suspects a thing," came Mark's voice, the cadence unmistakable. Jessica's response was softer, but the laughter that followed was intimate in a way that sent chills racing down Grace's spine. For a moment, Grace stood frozen at the threshold, her mind refusing to process what her ears had already accepted. Through the narrow crack in the door, she caught a glimpse of Mark, her husband, and Jessica, sitting close together on the edge of the bed. Their posture, their murmured words, the quiet, unguarded affection in their eyes. It told her everything she needed to know. The casserole slipped from Grace's hand, landing with a muffled thud on the landing, and the sound seemed to ripple out, breaking whatever magic had held the pair inside the room. She didn't wait to see their faces. Grace walked quietly down the stairs and out the front door. Moving through a fog so dense, it felt as though sound and color had been drained from her world. For the rest of the afternoon, Grace drifted through town, numb, wrapped in a cocoon of disbelief and humiliation. Anger fought with heartbreak, but what settled deeper was the crushing weight of betrayal. She replayed memories on an endless loop. Jessica's easy laughter at family gatherings, Mark's late nights at the office, the blithe reassurances she'd built her marriage upon, and watched as cracks spidered through every cherished moment. That night, long after the children were in bed, Grace sat alone in her dimly lit kitchen. She stared at the swirling patterns in her coffee and tried to anchor herself to something, anything, real. Every noise in the house seemed magnified.
Michael.
The hiss of the heater, the tick of the clock, the soft creak of the porch swing in the wind. The world she'd built felt suddenly unstable, as if the walls themselves questioned their place. Grace didn't cry, not at first. Instead, a strange clarity settled over her, a keen, almost clinical awareness of the depth of her pain. She realized with a start that her sorrow was matched by a sense of isolation, how easily happiness could be upended by secrets too painful to name. And through it all, she was gripped by a new, unfamiliar determination. She would not let chaos consume her family. Not without understanding how far this betrayal reached, not without a fight. Beneath the same roof where she had once felt safest, Grace now carried a splintered secret of her own. Everything had changed. The question was, what would she do next? Mark's sinister plan. In the brittle aftermath of shattered trust, Grace went about her routines with an eerie calmness, her eyes sharper than before, and her movements deliberate. The house, which just days ago had felt like a haven built of love and laughter, was now a place of guarded silence and careful observation. For the first time in her marriage, Grace was truly watching Mark, not as the man she thought she knew, but as someone capable of deception, perhaps far worse. She noticed things she'd once overlooked or dismissed, the fleeting looks Mark exchanged with Jessica during family gatherings, the secretive texts he received late at night, the whispered calls behind closed doors in his study. But these details, though deeply hurtful, were only the beginning. There was a new restlessness in Mark, a subtle but steady undercurrent of calculation in his every word and gesture. Grace suspected his betrayal wasn't confined to a fleeting affair. It reached into the very heart of their family's future. Her suspicions were confirmed on a gray Thursday evening. The children were at a sleepover, and Mark had told Grace he'd be home later than usual because of a last-minute meeting. Something about his tone rang false, the same way it had when he excused his absence from Eli's last baseball game. On impulse, Grace decided to take a walk, her feet carrying her not to Main Street, but to the quiet side road where Jessica lived. A light burned in Jessica's upstairs window. The world was hushed, trees whispering secrets in the darkness. Grace moved closer, feeling the guilt and adrenaline spike inside her. She reminded herself of the look on Mark's face when he thought no one was watching, the look of a man with something to hide. She moved silently along the hedge that separated Jessica's yard from the neighbors. The living room was empty, but murmured voices drifted through the open upstairs window. Grace held her breath, making out the cadence of Jessica's anxious tones and then Mark's deeper, more assured response. "It's almost done," he was saying. "She has no idea. I've started gathering all the documents, joint accounts, the deed, tax records. If the divorce goes through quick enough, I can make my case for primary custody. Judges favor stability, and with her only working part-time," Jessica interrupted, her voice low and urgent. "What if she finds out anything? What about the money?" Mark laughed, a sound so cold that Grace barely recognized it as her husband's. "I've hidden most of it already. Separate account, just like we planned. The trick is making her look unstable. You know, subtle things, forgetting to pick up the kids. Maybe she has a little wine in the evenings, misses a PTA meeting or two. Nothing dramatic, just
I found this
enough."
after he died.
A sickening dread settled over Grace. She listened on as Mark and Jessica plotted with an efficiency that suggested long rehearsal. They discussed accounts and calendars, lawyers and reputations. Marginalizing Grace in the eyes of the community was only step one. The ultimate prize was control of the assets she'd helped build, of the children she loved more than her own breathing, of the very future she'd always pictured as unshakable. "Once it's done, we can move. Start over somewhere new, sell the house, cash out everything," Mark said, his low voice urgent but giddy with anticipation. "She won't see it coming." Jessica seemed more hesitant. "But Grace,
Time to come out.
she's not stupid. If she fights back..."
Let's resolve this peacefully.
"She won't fight," Mark insisted. "She never has. That's her nature. She'll just fold, like she always does." Grace felt something hard inside her snap, a final unmooring from the illusion of safety. She slipped away from the shadows of Jessica's house, her mind raging with fear and indignation, but also a new, growing resolve. If Mark believed she would just fold, then he knew far less about her than he thought. The next days passed with predatory quiet. Mark's behavior towards Grace was calculated, overly polite, just attentive enough to seem normal to anyone outside. He made an effort to be home for dinner, smiled at the kids, even offered to take them out for ice cream, as if rehearsing the role of the perfect father for observers. But in the moments when he thought no one was looking, Grace detected an edge to his movements, the checking of bank statements, the careful gathering of mail, phone conversations that stopped dead the moment she entered the room. Grace adopted a mask of domestic calm, all the while noting every detail. She began collecting her own evidence. Bank statements left carelessly on the kitchen counter, emails glimpsed on Mark's open laptop, the mysterious increments in their joint account withdrawals.
Please, no.
She started to enter every detail into a notebook that she kept hidden at the bottom of her closet. Dates, amounts, times, conversations overheard, even her own emotional responses. It gave her a sense of order, a plan, a wall against the panic that threatened to overtake her every time she looked across the table at the man she thought she loved. One evening, while Mark was in the shower and the girls were brushing their teeth, Grace rifled through his desk drawer and found a manila folder labeled "Only Legal." Inside, she discovered photocopies of the mortgage, a list of their assets, and a typed sheet titled "Character Reference Points." The list detailed ordinary events, times Grace had picked up the children late from school, each cross-checked with the school calendar. a note about her prescription medication for anxiety, and a few receipts for wine from the grocery store. Reading down the page, Grace's hands trembled. It was clear Mark was building a case to depict her as an unfit, unstable parent. The betrayal stung, but it also fueled her determination. She realized Mark wasn't simply trying to end their marriage. He was staging a coup in their family, in their finances, in the narrative of their life. Mark was not just unfaithful, he was ruthless. On Sunday, the church service was crowded as usual, the sanctuary full of familiar faces. Mark sat beside Grace, hand on her shoulder, smiling and nodding to neighbors. To the congregation, they looked unchanged, a model couple, parents to two perfect children, pillars of the Willow Creek community. Only Grace knew the truth, that the man's hand on her shoulder was icy with calculation, his mind already engineering the next step of his quiet war. She met Jessica's eyes, in the choir loft, searching for a glimmer of regret, but Jessica's gaze slid away, cheeks flaming. Grace felt a quiet fury seething in her chest. She would not let them win, not with silence, not with surrender. From that day forward, Grace resolved to play the part Mark assigned her, but on her own terms. Her next steps would be careful, deliberate, unseen. She would protect her children. She would gather the truth, and she would make sure that, when the reckoning came, it would be Mark, not Grace, who lost everything. The terrifying silence. From the outside, nothing in the Thomas household appeared to have changed. The daily rituals continued with their practiced rhythm. Mark left for work at precisely 7:30 every morning. Grace waved him off from the porch. Eli and Sophie hustled out the door, backpacks bouncing on their way to school. The dog barked at the mailman, the coffee brewed, the mundane details filled each hour like clockwork. But beneath the surface, an icy silence pressed in, wrapping itself around the heart of Grace's world. It was a silence woven from fear, heartbreak, and a growing, stubborn resolve, a silence more dangerous than any outburst. While the world around her went on obliviously, Grace lived minute to minute, feeling the burden of secrets she could not yet reveal and the weight of a battle she knew she would have to fight alone. There were no tears now, not even in the quietest hours of the night.
Emily.
Grief had left her, replaced by something harder, sharper, and eerily calm. Every morning, she sat by the kitchen window to trace the soft golden light across the white picket fence, the cup of coffee in her hands going cold as her thoughts wound tightly around her new reality. Once, she would have confided in Jessica during such a crisis, found comfort in her friend's kitchen with laughter and shared sorrow. Now, even that comfort had been stolen from her, tainted and weaponized in Mark's ruthless game. Grace decided on silence, not as surrender, but as armor. She learned to swallow her emotions so deeply that no hint of trouble surfaced in her tone or her gaze. When Mark came home with forced concern in his voice, or sat across from her at the dinner table, acting every inch the considerate husband, Grace smiled back and matched his performance. She refused to give him evidence for his cruel narrative. She would not break, appear hysterical, or blame him in front of the children. To the world and to her family, she remained the steady, nurturing mother and wife. Only in the privacy of her mind did her questions spin and her anger mount. At night, while Mark typed away in his study and the children slept, Grace turned inward. The silence weighed upon her, heart pounding against her ribs in the dark. She focused on details, replaying conversations, remembering every glance and offhand comment, collecting evidence with the precision of a detective. Her journal became her secret weapon. In its leather-bound pages, she recorded everything: dates, times, odd behaviors, strange financial transactions, even snippets of conversation she overheard when Mark didn't realize how closely she was listening. She began to catalog the subtle ways Mark and Jessica tried to undermine her. The tense whispers she heard at church socials, the sidelong looks, the polite but forced interactions between Jessica and Grace at school events. Small acts, easily overlooked, started to form a pattern. Mark rearranged his calendar to take the kids alone more often, and sometimes forgot to pass along messages from Eli's teacher or Sophie's dance instructor, making Grace appear forgetful. Wine bottles disappeared from the pantry faster than she drank them, and Grace found herself double-checking the locks on the medicine cabinet. It was a campaign of small sabotages designed to make her doubt her own memory and judgment, and to create a paper trail for Mark's growing dossier. The fear of what Mark might do next shadowed every decision. Grace became hyper-aware of her surroundings. She took care never to leave a mess, never to snap at the children, never to show the slightest sign of strain in public. At the grocery store, she greeted her neighbors warmly and complimented the bakery staff on their cinnamon rolls, even as her mind raced with contingency plans. Grace began to document her whereabouts, save receipts, and forward school emails to herself, little lifelines in a court battle she suspected was coming. Despite her care, anxiety clung to her like a second skin. Sometimes in the silence, anger welled up so fiercely that she gripped the edge of the kitchen counter just to steady herself. There were moments when she looked at Mark and saw only a stranger, an invader in her home. Once, while folding laundry, she thought she heard someone whisper her name from the hallway, only to realize it was her own mind echoing with doubt and fear. Yet through the dread, Grace found resolve she didn't know she possessed. Each day she survived without breaking felt like a small victory. She held her children a little tighter when they hugged her goodnight, memorized the way their hair smelled of shampoo in summer, noticed how Eli's eyes sparkled when he talked about dinosaurs. She reminded herself that everything she did was for them. Her silence was a shield, not a void. There were close calls, moments when the mask nearly slipped. One Saturday morning, as Mark cleaned out the garage, Grace found a letter from a lawyer tucked among the old paint cans. Her hand shook as she tucked it away, copied down the firm's name, and returned it to its hiding place. When Sophie scraped her knee and burst into tears that afternoon, Grace nearly cried with her, the fear and exhaustion momentarily threatening to spill over. But she held it together, soothed her daughter, and pressed on. Church, once her place of sanctuary, became another stage for her, performance. Grace greeted friends, joined in hymns, and nodded along to sermons about forgiveness and family. But her eyes scanned the pews for signs of shifting loyalties. She watched Mark and Jessica, saw the tension in their postures, the restraint in their interactions, and logged it all away. No one in Willow Creek suspected that Grace's silence was anything more than gentleness, that beneath her calm exterior, a fierce storm was gathering. Grace began to notice the gradual shifting of her own emotions. The pain dulled, replaced by strategy. She learned to listen rather than talk, to notice rather than react. Her silence, once forced upon her by shock, became her greatest weapon. Without warning, she started to see opportunities. An overheard snippet here, a careless admission there. She quietly began building her army, not with words, but with watchfulness and evidence. She phrased her questions carefully to friends and colleagues, collected their reactions, gauged their loyalties, and tucked away every piece of information that could one day help her. As spring crept closer and the first hints of green pushed through the frost, Grace watched her children play in the backyard, their laughter ringing out into the stillness. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment of hope. She might be silent, but she was not defeated. Underneath the careful facade she presented to the world, a new version of Grace, stronger, wiser, and utterly determined, was taking shape. By the end of each day, the silence in the Thomas home was no longer a prison, but the quiet before the storm. Grace knew that soon, the secrets festering in the dark would come to light. And when that moment arrived, she would be ready, not to lash out in anger, but to defend her children, her dignity, and her future with a clarity and resolve she had never possessed before. The counterattack begins. The weeks that followed were marked by a subtle shift in the atmosphere of Willow Creek. To an outsider, there was nothing to betray the brewing storm within the Thomas family. The house remained neat, Grace's smile persistently gentle. But beneath the composed surface, Grace was no longer simply enduring. She was preparing to act. If Mark and Jessica believed silence had made her weak, they were about to learn that it had made her watchful and far more dangerous. Her first weapon was knowledge. Through sleepless nights and anxious mornings, Grace had assembled an intricate web of facts, motives, and connections in her hidden journal. Every bank withdrawal Mark made, every strange glance he and Jessica shared, every unreturned phone call from a neighbor went into her records. She mapped out the relationships that kept Mark's reputation afloat: influential co-workers, empathetic church members, his parents, pillars of the small-town community. In her mind, she began to see not just her struggle, but the battlefield itself. Grace's counteroffensive started with the softest touch. She did not confront Mark. Instead, she subtly allowed select pieces of information to trickle into the community. At a Saturday morning bake sale in the church parking lot, she let slip to Mrs. Hargrove, the church secretary and perhaps the fastest distributor of news in town, that Mark had seemed tired lately, distracted by mysterious finances, often away late on workdays. There was no accusation, just a gently worried tone and a mother's sigh. By the following Tuesday, the rumor mill had begun to turn in earnest. Her next step involved Mark's workplace. Grace knew several of his co-workers from community activities, so when John Sims's wife called about the upcoming charity auction, Grace, in a tone of confidential concern, mentioned how hard Mark was working, that she hoped his new stress wasn't related to all those extra private meetings. She trusted John's wife to tell her husband, and John to tell his colleagues. Within days, Mark found himself fielding polite, pointed questions about his schedule from colleagues and supervisors alike. But Grace was careful never to push too hard or too fast. Every conversation was couched in compassion, never outright suspicion. A mention of how exhausting insurance paperwork could be, an offhand remark about Mark's recent forgetfulness with the kids' schedules. What began as whispers soon became a gentle but growing doubt in the minds around them. At home, she reinforced her image as the caring, dependable mother. She volunteered for new committees at school, attended every parent meeting, quietly corrected every slip Mark tried to engineer against her. When a teacher sent home a note about Eli missing an assignment that Mark had forgotten to deliver, Grace calmly brought it to the principal, explaining that she feared things were falling through the cracks because of how much Mark had taken on lately. The school staff, who had always admired her dedication, rallied more closely to her side, their eyes sharpening in the presence of Mark's now frequent absences and vague explanations. Grace widened her web. She reached out to Mark's parents, her voice warm but vulnerable on the phone, lamenting that marriage could have its tough spots, that she hoped Mark was opening up to them the way she encouraged her children to confide in her. Mark's mother heard everything. Within a week, Grace sensed a new chill in her in-laws' demeanor toward their son. Jessica, for her part, began to look harried and avoidant. Grace started attending the same community yoga class, greeting her former friend with kindness in public while making a point to speak warmly of Jessica's support during this difficult time. The effect was immediate. Jessica became nervous and withdrawn, her anxiety feeding whispers that perhaps she knew more than she let on. All the while, Grace was strategic, never spilling everything at once. She wanted doubt to flourish naturally, to let the cracks in Mark's image widen on their own. She carefully gathered physical evidence as well: bank statements, copies of emails, snapshots of suspicious text messages. She secured them in a safety deposit box under her own name at the local bank, something even Mark, with all his stealth, did not discover. At community functions, Grace became a living embodiment of poise, volunteering at the food pantry, organizing the children's reading club, always appearing with a steady demeanor. She made a point of supporting local business owners, spending a little extra time at O'Malley's grocery and the corner bakery, reinforcing her relationships around town. Her intent was clear: to showcase her reliability while sowing uncertainty about Mark's. Gradually, Grace noticed the change. Mark grew more irritable at home. He asked pointed questions about her days, looked for signs of accusation that weren't there. His confidence eroded further when a coworker made a joke about his mystery meetings at a neighborhood dinner. Grace, as usual, only smiled sweetly and changed the subject, leaving the circle buzzing with speculation. At family dinners, Mark grew quieter, glancing at Grace as if she had become a stranger whose moves he could no longer predict. The effect on Jessica was even more dramatic. She became the subject of whispered conversations at church, drew nervous glances at the grocery store, and found old friends suddenly too busy for coffee. The strength of the bond between Grace and Jessica had once been a comfort, but now the town's affection had shifted. Jessica looked increasingly isolated, and more than once, Grace caught her staring from across a crowded room, part pleading, part fearful that the truth was creeping closer. Grace's children, blissfully unaware of the adult machinations swirling around them, slipped more easily into her orbit. She spent afternoons with them in the backyard, helping them with school projects and listening to their stories. This quiet, constant presence only reinforced to friends and teachers that Grace was a devoted and trustworthy parent. As spring deepened, Grace realized her strategy was working. The confidence Mark once wore like armor had begun to crack. The allies he'd counted on, a supportive boss, sympathetic friends, the approving gaze of the community, were slipping away by degrees. He was still in control of much, but for the first time in their marriage, Grace could see fear in his eyes. Yet she held back. The counterattack was not about vengeance. It was about defense of her children, her dignity, and her hard-won place in the town. Grace intended to reveal the truth, but only when the ground was most favorable for her and most perilous for him. For now, she was content to let the seeds she had planted take root, watching closely as Mark's social foundation began to erode. With each passing day, Willow Creek itself felt different to Grace, no longer merely a small town, but the arena of her quiet revolution. For the first time since her world had splintered, Grace felt not terror, but purpose. The terrifying silence of weeks past was gone. In its place was the determined, steady heartbeat of someone who knew exactly what she was fighting for. Collapse. As sunlight crept through the thinning curtains of spring, change swept quietly but inexorably through Willow Creek. Mark Thomas, once the model husband, steady employee, and trustworthy neighbor, began to feel it before anyone dared say it aloud. The air between him and Grace had grown colder, but it wasn't the volatile cold of anger. It was a dense, unyielding frost that separated him from the world he once commanded. He noticed it first at work. The lively banter in the office kitchen dried up when he entered. His colleagues' conversations tapered to polite, stilted exchanges. Invitations to after-hours gatherings grew scarce. It wasn't that anyone accused him directly, but there was a heavy silence after every word, punctuated by sidelong glances. When he asked for help on a particularly complicated insurance claim, his request was met with awkward hesitations. Even his supervisor, Mr. Luther, once an ally, had begun to keep their meetings brief and their pleasantries strained. Behind the professional facade, rumors had begun their slow, venomous crawl. Mark had money troubles, or maybe a crisis at home. He was seen late at the office, but not always working. Grace's gentle comments, seeded weeks earlier, had blossomed into a patchwork of suspicions. Mark scrambled to control the narrative, but found himself chasing whispers he couldn't pin down. At church, too, the tide had turned. As the organ's opening prelude filled the sanctuary one Sunday, Mark noticed the deliberate spacing in the pews. Friends who once greeted him warmly now forced quick, uncomfortable smiles. After service, Mrs. Sinclair asked about the twins' school play, and then, when Mark replied, turned unexpectedly to Grace for confirmation. Her faith in his word subtly, painfully eroded. Jessica felt the town's scrutiny long before she admitted it to herself. Mornings grew tense and lonely. Children she once drove to school with her daughter now caught rides with others, their mothers apologizing with vague excuses. At the market, Jessica found herself alone by the produce, her former confidants busily chatting in the next aisle with their backs turned. Even brief exchanges felt weighted, neighbors searching her face for truth or admission. At home, Jessica's anxiety spilled into everything. She snapped at her own children, overreacted to minor mishaps, and began to dread each new day. Her attempts to reach out, inviting friends for coffee, volunteering at the church's food drive, were met with careful politeness, followed by thinly veiled avoidance. The pressure mounted for Mark. He tried, at first, to downplay the change, insisting to Grace one morning as she packed the children's lunches, "People are always bored in the spring. They'll move on soon enough." But the edges of desperation crept into his voice. He tried harder at work, staying later, sending elaborate updates and kind emails to colleagues. With each attempt, the results were the same. People smiled, nodded, then stepped away the moment he turned his back. At home, the walls closed in. Mark sensed Grace's new strength in the smallest interactions, the way she looked him in the eye, the careful calm in her words, the subtle implication that she was always, quietly, a step ahead. No matter how he tried to provoke or cajole her, she would not rise to the bait. The children, sensing the tension, clung to routines with more determination, seeking solace in Grace's steadfast presence. Mark's parents, once unwavering defenders of their son, grew distant. A chilly Sunday afternoon visit turned into an intervention, with his mother wringing her hands and his father asking pointed questions about the family's finances and his commitment to Grace. Their eyes, full of worry and disappointment, broke through Mark's practiced reassurances. Grace's careful confiding had awakened a quiet, skeptical inquiry in them. "You know we'll always love you, Mark," his mother whispered, "but families have to be honest with each other, especially now." At first, Mark tried to blame everything on stress. His work, the pressure of raising a family, a few misunderstandings. But as the days wore on, his explanations grew thinner, and the patience around him wore out. Eli's school sent a formal email about a pattern of uncommunicated absences. Sophie's dance coach questioned why parental notes were late or missing. Grace, ever present, gently shrugged when someone asked about Mark's whereabouts, quietly thanking her concern for the children's stability. Jessica, meanwhile, spiraled into isolation. Her own family sensed the shift. Her husband noticed the way she stared at her phone or lost herself in anxious silence. She found herself snapping at her daughter, who retreated, confused and wounded, to her room. Jessica's social circle, once bound by easy laughter and mutual support, shrank to a single tight knot of suspicion and strained civility. She could sense conversations falling silent when she entered a room, invitations that failed to arrive, and gestures of support that felt empty. Whispers of, "She must know," or, "There's always something odd between them," began to precede her at every gathering. A crisis finally erupted in the office when a harmless audit turned into a review of recent withdrawals and expense approvals. Mark's explanations stuttered and fell apart under scrutiny. When confronted with inconsistencies, he found his usually persuasive charm had no effect.
Copy that.
Human Resources requested a personal leave of absence while they reviewed his conduct in light of certain financial irregularities and community concerns. No one needed to say more. Mark understood he was being pushed to the edge. Though Grace had not exposed every detail, her orchestrated skepticism and precise documentation had opened fissures in Mark's life that nothing could mend. Willow Creek's slow, close-knit rhythms had absorbed the evidence of his betrayals, burned away the layers of his finer persona, and found only self-interest and callousness underneath. One evening, facing Grace across the dinner table, Mark saw in her eyes not bitterness, but an unmovable calm. "Are you really so certain you can win?" he threatened quietly, as if trying to reclaim the upper hand. Grace paused, her hand steady, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not interested in winning. I'm interested in truth and our children's future." The words, delivered gently, held the finality of a verdict. By this point, the collapse was almost complete. Mark, shunned by most colleagues, questioned by his own parents, avoided by neighbors, and growing ever more isolated within his own home, began to realize that the world he'd manipulated for so long had slipped, irrevocably, through his fingers. Jessica, hollow-eyed with sleepless guilt, faced a similar exile. Her friendships vanished, her comfort forever changed. As late spring's first storms rolled through, thunderous and cleansing, Grace sat awake while her children slept, listening to the wind shake the house. She felt no triumph, but a sense of hard-earned peace. The collapse was not loud or dramatic as Mark or Jessica might have feared, but a suffocating unraveling, a slow, inevitable loss of standing, trust, and belonging. Grace knew the battle was not yet completely over, but in that moment, surrounded by the steadfast rhythm of a home reclaimed, she saw with quiet certainty the ruin her quiet resistance had wrought. The truth revealed. There are moments when a lie, nurtured in shadow and silence, can no longer withstand the weight of truth. In Willow Creek, that moment finally arrived, unexpectedly quiet, but world-altering in consequence. For months, rumors and suspicions had floated through the town like pollen on the spring breeze. The cracks in Mark and Grace's marriage had widened beyond the point of subtle repair, but no one outside the immediate family understood the depths of the deception or the full scope of betrayal. It was Grace, steadfast and patient, even in heartache, who decided that the illusion must end. It began in the kitchen of the Thomas home, on a Sunday morning thick with anticipation. Sunlight poured in through the bay windows, illuminating dust motes that seemed to hang in the silence after the truth had lived so long in darkness. Grace moved with calm purpose, arranging plates of muffins and a pot of coffee on the table and calling for the family to sit down. Her children, unaware of what awaited, tumbled into their seats with the casual, chaotic energy of youth. Mark, eyes watchful and wary these days, entered last, taking his seat as if bracing for a storm. Grace's voice was soft but steady. "There's something we need to talk about as a family," she said. Eli and Sophie looked up in surprise. Mark's lips pressed into a hard, thin line. Grace gathered her thoughts, finding a strength she scarcely recognized in herself. "I haven't been honest with you all," she began, her gaze flicking from her husband to her children. "There are things happening in our family that you deserve to know. I've tried to protect you, but I won't do it with secrets anymore."
We do.
Her hands trembled slightly as she told the story. Not every sordid detail, but enough. She explained that their father had made choices that hurt the family deeply, that trust had been broken, and that things would be changing. As she spoke, Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and Eli's face set in angry confusion. Mark attempted to interject, to twist her words, but Grace silenced him with a calm, unwavering look. "It's your turn to listen," she told him quietly. For the first time, he sat back and said nothing. Afterward, Grace dressed the children and, arm in arm, walked them to her in-laws' home. She spoke with Mark's parents in the foyer, sharing the truth of what had passed and producing the evidence she had so meticulously gathered. Bank statements, emails, notes from teachers, and her own journal. Mark's parents were stunned, disbelief giving way first to denial and finally settling into a deep, sorrowful shame.
They knew too much.
The next day, Grace prepared herself for what would come, a reckoning not just within her family, but within the entire community that had watched, whispered, and wondered. At the church, she requested a meeting with Pastor Hendricks and several respected elders. She explained, humbly but with clarity, what had happened. The affair, Mark's secretive planning, the attempts to portray her as unfit and manipulate the court's opinion in case of divorce. She offered her documentation, not as a plea for pity, but so the truth could no longer be deliberately distorted by rumor. Word spread faster than Grace anticipated. At first, the hesitancy was palpable. No one wanted to believe such ugliness could exist beneath the facade of one of Willow Creek's most beloved families. But Grace's quiet dignity, the honesty in her eyes, and the weight of the evidence left no room for denial. Mark found out how rapidly his social capital had diminished the moment he tried to plead his case. At the local diner, he pulled aside old friends, laying out his own narrative, that Grace was vindictive, unstable, and out to ruin him. But this time, he was greeted with uncomfortable silences. A few people excused themselves and left. Others nodded politely, then changed the subject. Even his closest allies now kept a safe distance. Grace's careful groundwork had not gone unnoticed. Jessica, meanwhile, faced an even colder reality. After church service, parents averted their gazes. Her daughter's friends stopped inviting her to birthday parties. Volunteers at the school's spring fair assigned Jessica the least visible tasks. Grace had not sought retribution, but the town's judgment was precise and swift, meted out through 1,000 minor rejections. For Grace, the days that followed were a whirlwind of pain and relief. She fielded endless questions, mostly careful, sometimes prying, from neighbors hungry for details or seeking assurance that they too could spot betrayal before it destroyed their lives. She answered gently, refusing to indulge gossip, always steering the conversation back to her resolve to protect her children and rebuild her life with transparency. Eli and Sophie struggled in their own ways. Eli became withdrawn and quiet at school, quick to anger at small slights, but gradually opened up to the counselor Grace had arranged for him. Sophie cried herself to sleep for days, clutching tightly to Grace's hand, her confusion and sense of broken trust raw and unfiltered. Grace held her children each night, promising that even though their foundation had shattered, she would keep them safe and loved. Some nights, Grace wandered through the empty house, touching the framed photographs that lined the hallways, family vacations, holiday parties, school recitals. These were remnants of a life now revealed to be fragile, but in the quiet, she felt something unfamiliar, the faintest suggestion of hope. She had not been destroyed by the truth. Indeed, the act of telling it, of refusing to accept a life built on lies, had made her stronger. Community support began to blossom in unexpected places. The bakery owner sent home extra treats for the kids. A circle of mothers quietly rallied around Grace, inviting her for coffee, leaving thoughtful notes and offers to help with errands. Several teachers went out of their way to praise her children's resilience at school. While the gossips of Willow Creek still whispered, their tones were more sympathetic than condemning. Grace's honesty had shifted the narrative from shame to courage. By the time Grace stood before the congregation at Sunday service, her hands no longer trembled. She spoke briefly, thanking everyone for their kindness, and reminded them that every family carries burdens unseen. "If there's one thing I hope my children learn from this," she said, "it's that telling the truth, even when it breaks your heart, will always make room for new beginnings." The congregation rose, a wave of warmth enveloping her. Mark, now seated far in the back, wore a look of exhaustion and defeat. Jessica hovered near the exit, eyes downcast, excluded from the comfort that Grace's honesty had made possible. Grace knew the journey ahead would not be easy, but she also knew she no longer walked its path alone. The truth, though painful, had at last set her free. Departure and rebirth. Early summer arrived in Willow Creek with a slow, gentle inevitability. Soft green buds stretched into the light. The fields hummed with new life, and the town seemed to breathe more easily in the warmth. But within the little white house at the center of town, change felt like an earthquake. Even as sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor and birds sang by the picket fence, everything about the Thomas household was about to be rewritten. The day Mark left was strangely ordinary. He rose first, as he always had, but instead of going to the kitchen, he packed in near silence. Each footstep on the hardwood floor echoed. Each drawer opening and closing seemed to punctuate the end of a chapter that had already unraveled beyond repair. What little was left of cordiality between Mark and Grace had been spent in the storm of truth. Now, there was only necessity and cold acknowledgement. His departure was not marked by shouting, not even by tears. He lingered for a moment in the foyer, glancing at the family photos that lined the staircase. A child's grin missing a front tooth, Grace beaming at a Christmas party, himself holding Eli aloft after a Little League win. For a heartbeat, Mark's shoulders sagged, the weight of consequence settling on him more heavily than any suitcase. Grace stood in the doorway, watchful but resolute. She said nothing. There was no need. The lines had been drawn, the damage done. Mark managed a hoarse "goodbye," directed somewhere between his children's bedrooms and the woman he no longer understood. He left without looking back, his figure receding against the June morning. The official proceedings that followed moved quickly. Mark, exposed and chastened by evidence and community judgment, made little effort to challenge Grace in the custody battle. The town had already narrowed its gaze. Judges, social workers, and even his own parents weighed in on Grace's steadfastness, her ability to keep the children's lives as stable as possible. Mark's solitary, half-hearted claims that he could provide better structure rang hollow against his misconduct and the trail of deception he'd left behind. Grace, trembling but determined, stood in the courtroom alongside her lawyer and accepted the terms with a measured dignity. Joint legal custody, but physical custody to Grace, with clearly defined visitation rights. Eli and Sophie would remain with her in Willow Creek, a decision echoed by teachers, neighbors, and the small circle of friends who'd become her guardians. Mark's new address was a small apartment 2 towns over, not quite temporary, not yet anything like a home. Every part of life in the weeks that followed was colored by adjustment, longing, and cautious hope. For the children, there was confusion and mourning. A father relegated to weekend calls, visits that felt awkward and rare. Grace saw the changes in their eyes, felt the flinch of sadness in Sophie's voice when she whispered, "Does Dad still love us?" Before bedtime. Eli grew quiet, channeling his heartache into bus rides and endless games of catch against the garden fence. But what had once felt like unbearable absence slowly became, for all three of them, a space for new rhythms and subtle joys. Grace made a promise to herself. Their home would not be defined by what had been lost, but by what remained and what they could build. She rearranged the living room, shifting old memories into new places. Gone were some of the portraits of happier times that now felt burdensome, replaced by paintings Eli and Sophie made at school, photographs from a picnic in the sun with just the three of them. She baked more, inviting the children to help knead dough, laughing at their flour-dusted faces. They planted sunflowers along the back fence, watched them creep upward together, and celebrated each inch as if it were a miracle. The silence that had once haunted the Thomas household now began to dissipate. In its place, conversation and music filtered through each room. Grace learned to leave the porch light on for late-night talks, to say yes to spontaneous ice cream trips, to accept awkward but genuine offers of help from neighbors. She reached out to Pastor Hendricks, volunteering for the food pantry. She joined book club at the library, steeling herself to open up piece by piece. Little by little, Willow Creek wrapped Grace and her children in a new kind of safety net. The townspeople, moved by her honesty and humble resilience, found ways to help that were quiet and meaningful. Meals left on the stoop, a ride to the school play when she worked late, invitations to birthday parties for Sophie and Eli. After church each Sunday, Mrs. Hargrove would tuck a bag of fresh muffins into Grace's hands, for the kids, as if this simple act could steady any storm. Yet, not all wounds healed quickly. There were nights when Grace lay awake, twisting the wedding ring she no longer wore on her finger, listening for the creaks and groans of a house that felt unfamiliar in its emptiness. There were days Eli refused to go to soccer practice, missing his father's cheers, and afternoons when Sophie cried at stories that once made her laugh. But in their grief, Grace found courage. She held them tightly, repeating a quiet mantra: "We are enough, just as we are. We will keep going." For herself, Grace rediscovered independence in unexpected ways. She took morning walks past cornfields shimmering gold in summer light, breathing in freedom and uncertainty with every step. She revived neglected hobbies, watercolors on the back porch, baking bread from a recipe her mother had scrawled in fading ink. She wrote letters to friends she'd lost touch with and found, in their replies, vestiges of the easy companionship she thought she might never have again. There were, too, tentative glimmers of new beginnings. One afternoon, as she helped Eli construct a solar system diorama for science class, she caught herself smiling, realizing the house was full of warmth she hadn't felt in years. Sophie invited friends over for a backyard picnic. Grace listened from the kitchen window as their laughter drifted over the fence. The world, colored first by loss, was blooming once again with possibility. As summer deepened, word reached Grace that Mark had left Willow Creek for good. Unable to weather the strain of small-town whispers and his own mistakes, he found a new job 2 hours away and moved on, alone. There was little satisfaction for Grace in this, only an acknowledgement that each of them now bore the consequences of choices made in darkness. On the first day of September, as golden leaves began their slow descent, Grace gathered the children beneath the old maple tree in the yard. "We made it," she told them softly, arms encircling their shoulders. Things are changing, yes, but we're still a family, and we will grow, just like this tree, no matter what happens. That night, for the first time in a long time, Grace slept soundly, no longer haunted by fear or heartbreak, but by gratitude for what the storm had left intact, hope, and the strength to begin again. Light at the end of the tunnel. The seasons in Willow Creek turned, as they always had. But for Grace Thomas and her children, each new day felt a little brighter, a subtle yet undeniable contrast to the shadows that had once threatened to consume their world. Summer's warmth gave way to the gold and amber of a gentle autumn. Cicadas quieted, and the air grew crisp, scented with the promise of change. For Grace, these small shifts proved more profound than any sweeping dramatic event. Healing, she realized, was not something that arrived all at once. It didn't announce itself with banners or celebrations, but appeared quietly, in a laugh that came more easily, in a morning spent lingering over pancakes with Eli and Sophie, in the way sunlight slanted across the kitchen table and made the ordinary beautiful. Rebuilding trust, moment by moment. Each day offered new opportunities to rebuild, not only the household, but the fragile trust that had been shattered. Grace made time for long talks with her children, their conversations sometimes circling past hurts before drifting onto safe, hopeful ground. She encouraged them to name their fears, their wishes, even the moments when they missed their father. There were still tears, Sophie's especially, but there was also an ever-growing reservoir of resilience. Grace and the children began to sleep with the bedroom doors open again. Nightmares, once nightly visitors, became rare. She learned, too, to trust herself. Each choice she made, from finances to discipline to the simple business of keeping the house running, was hers alone. There were missteps, overcooked dinners, forgotten appointments, days when loneliness nearly overwhelmed her. But Grace forgave herself more easily these days. She embraced the imperfections, teaching the children that it was okay to stumble as long as they kept moving forward together. Becoming a beacon.
This is it.
Gradually, word of Grace's quiet courage spread through Willow Creek, not in whispers of scandal, but in stories of hope. At the school, teachers spoke of how Eli threw himself into science, of Sophie's sweet determination at the spelling bee. Pastor Hendricks began referencing the kindness that can come in times of transition, an unmistakable nod to Grace's willingness to volunteer, to help neighbors, to listen without judgment. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around the Thomas home now sought Grace's advice on everything from church events to how to handle a child's outburst. She didn't see herself as a leader, but others did. When Mrs. Donovan lost her husband unexpectedly, it was Grace who organized meals for the family and spent an afternoon teaching Mrs. Donovan's grandkids to make paper airplanes. When a new mother moved to Willow Creek, struggling to fit in, Grace invited her for coffee, sharing stories and laughter that calmed the woman's nerves. These small acts, once unthinkable in the depth of Grace's own pain, became second nature, as if by helping others, she was making sense of her own suffering. Finding joy in the everyday. The Thomas house changed, not in its bones, but in its spirit. Music, once absent, returned. Grace played old records on weekend mornings, Motown for cleaning, gentle folk songs for homework time. She encouraged the children to fill the air with stories and jokes. The old porch swing, silent for months, once again creaked with laughter as evening stretched out, fireflies blinking lazily over the grass. Meals became times of sharing, not just food, but gratitude. Grace began a new tradition. Before dinner, each family member shared one thing that had brought them joy that day. Some days, Sophie's voice would tremble as she remembered something small, a compliment from a classmate, her favorite song playing on the radio. But she always found something to mention. Eli, having rediscovered his smile, started recording their moments of joy in a little spiral notebook. New dreams and uncertain tomorrows. For herself, Grace allowed dreams to return. For so long, her world had shrunk to survival, self-preservation, and protection of her children. Now, she revisited old ambitions and tried new things. She enrolled in an evening course at the county community college, learning the basics of bookkeeping with an eye toward better job prospects. On weekends, she took the kids hiking, letting them pick trails even if it meant muddy shoes and slow afternoons. There were visits from Mark too, but they became less fraught. The children learned that love could endure despite absence, even if it changed shape. Grace managed birthdays and holidays with warmth, never letting awkwardness overcome their small household's sense of togetherness. Communication with Mark became businesslike, free of lingering bitterness. She built boundaries not from anger, but from wisdom earned at a heavy cost. The town's nurturing embrace. As autumn deepened, Willow Creek seemed to acknowledge Grace's journey with small, thoughtful gestures. The librarian recommended books on single parenting and resilience. The hardware store owner gave her a discount on a new set of paintbrushes. For your kids' projects, he winked. On Halloween, the bakery sent over a box of sugar cookies for Eli and Sophie, decorated with smiling pumpkins and "Welcome back" written in icing. Several families who had once distanced themselves from the Thomases offered their friendship anew. Grace could sense a shift. People respected her not just for enduring hardship, but for rising from it with humility and grace. Sometimes, as she walked down Main Street, a familiar hand would squeeze hers, or a neighbor would offer a ride, or the postmistress would slip an extra stamp into her shopping bag. A new story, not defined by the past. Still, there were hard days. Grief flared at unexpected moments. Sophie's tears after a dance recital. Eli's abrupt sullenness when a friend made a careless remark about fathers. For Grace, loneliness still swelled now and again, on quiet Sunday evenings, or when she encountered reminders of what she had lost. But through this, Grace refused to see herself as tragic. If anything, she became the living proof that pain could be the birthplace of something far greater. Her children, steadily braver, began to invite friends over again. The backyard, neglected for so long, filled with voices, games, and the scent of newly planted flowers. Grace found herself hoping, truly hoping for the first time, that happiness could root itself here. Closing the chapter, honoring the light. On the first frosty morning of winter, Grace woke early and wrapped herself in her favorite old sweater. She boiled tea, stepping outside to watch the sunrise with Sophie and Eli bundled beside her. "Look," she pointed, as the first rays flashed pink across the endless sky. "Sometimes the world gives us something beautiful just for being awake." Eli squeezed her hand. Sophie, head still resting on Grace's shoulder, smiled up at her. In that quiet moment, Grace understood that the light at the end of the tunnel she'd so often imagined wasn't a distant beacon, but all around her, in the everyday, the ordinary, the love she and her children had rebuilt. Their story was not one of perfect endings, but of strength slowly revealed. Grace had become not just a survivor, but a symbol, the quiet light that promised, to herself and to Willow Creek, that even in the darkest winter, hope could be cultivated, tended, and made to shine.